Lord Peter Wimsey had often remarked, when conversation at Boodle's flagged or when poor Parker looked particularly dismal over the latest Home Office inefficiency, that the worst thing about murder in the countryside was the dreariness of the upholstery. One might be forgiven for bludgeoning one's cousin if one had to look at damask curtains in peach for more than a fortnight. Thus it was, with his customary sympathy for the aesthetically oppressed, that Lord Peter found himself seated in a rather lumpy armchair at Windmere Lodge, a red-brick Victorian hybrid crouched like a gouty matron at the edge of the Cotswolds. Outside, a spectral mist hung over the hedgerows, like a petticoat forgotten on a railing. Inside, a corpse lay in the breakfast room, staring reproachfully at an untouched kipper. "Well," said Wimsey, spooning a precise half-portion of thick-cut marmalade onto his toast, "either Colonel Fentiman has taken up performance art, or we are in for a most tedious inquiry." Superintendent Barstow, who had the geniality of a man not easily impressed by marmalade or noblemen, looked up with a grunt. "Dead as stone, my lord." No sign of forced entry. Housemaid found him like that. Gas fire on, door locked from the inside. "Suicide?" Wimsey inquired, tilting his head like a curious wren. "Though not, I think, by drowning in citrus preserves. Not unless the colonel had a secret fondness for the dramatic." Barstow sighed. "No note, no weapon, no sign of struggle, but the doctor says it was poison." "In the tea, a tragically domestic end," said Wimsey. He rose, strolled over to the breakfast tray, and regarded the half-finished pot of Darjeeling with the respectful detachment one usually reserved for minor Greek tragedies. "No milk." How Spartan of him. "Colonel had ulcers," offered Barstow. "Doctor's orders. Lived like a monk. Regular as clockwork. Breakfast at 7:30, stroll at 8, chess at 10. Hadn't missed it in 10 years. Wimsey's gaze drifted from the tea to the window. The sash was ajar by half an inch, letting in a finger of mist. The carpet around the fireplace was scuffed in a curious crescent, and, most interestingly, the mantel clock read 8:17, though Wimsey's own watch, which was a gift from a Viennese horologist with views on punctuality bordering on the fascistic, declared the time to be 8:42. "A pity," murmured Wimsey, almost to himself, "when the machinery of domesticity falters at its most essential moment." Barstow gave him a wary look. "Don't see what's so odd. Fentiman was an old man, had money, enemies, and opinions. You can't move in Windmere Village without tripping over one of them." "I dare say," said Wimsey, "though I find it odd that a man so precise in his breakfast ritual should forget to wind his clock." He turned. The housemaid, a red-cheeked girl named Elsie, stood wringing her hands in the hallway, flanked by a butler who resembled a retired gargoyle and an elderly cook with an expression like congealed despair. "Perhaps," said Lord Peter Wimsey, drawing on his gloves with a flourish, "we might begin with the matter of marmalade, for in a house so ruled by order, the placement of a preserve might yet prove illuminating." And with that, the absurdity of the morning, dead colonels, crooked clocks, and contradictory toast rolled open its first ironic curtain. The housemaid, Elsie, hovered on the threshold like an unfortunate wren afraid to speak for fear of shattering the solemn hush that had settled over Windmere Lodge. Her gaze kept darting between the still body of Colonel Fentiman and the far less still figure of Lord Peter Wimsey, who, with a slight air of theatrical detachment, was now crouched to examine a faint smudge on the carpet beside the sideboard. "You laid the breakfast tray yourself, did you not?" he asked without turning his head, his voice smooth and oddly musical. Elsie bobbed a quick curtsy. "Yes, my lord. 7:30, same as always. He always wanted it right after the bells from St. Bede's chime and before the post." Wimsey stood. "Ah, charmingly Anglican precision. And did anyone else handle the tray?" "No, my lord. Cook put the tea in the pot, but I carried it all myself. Colonel didn't like anyone poking about once he was eating. Very particular he was. Yes, ulcers and military habits. Two of the least forgiving mistresses. And what did you see when you entered this morning? Elsie looked down at her hands. He was sitting just like that, sir. Only the cup was fallen like, and there was a drip of it, tea, I mean, down his chin, but he still had his napkin tucked in. I thought he might have just nodded off, but when I called his name, well, I knew. Hysterics? No, sir, she said firmly, with a flicker of pride. I put down the tray and told Mr. Gudgeon. Mr. Gudgeon, the butler, inclined his head with the heavy dignity of a man who had served too long to be surprised by corpses at breakfast. Quite composed, he said, remarkably so, considering her class. Thank you, Gudgeon, Whimsy murmured, eyes flitting toward the sideboard. And this is the usual arrangement, I suppose. He gestured toward the tray, a pot of tea with the lid set askew, a single poached egg cooling in its porcelain nest, 2 slices of toast, 1 buttered, 1 untouched, and a small silver-topped pot of marmalade. Yes, my lord, Gudgeon replied. The colonel always preferred thick cut, only the Fortnum's variety, mind you. Any substitution, and he would have rung furiously. Ah, Fortnum's, a man of taste. And is that the colonel's own teaspoon? Of course, my lord. Whimsy lifted it delicately. Monogrammed. Good heavens, the man was positively Georgian in his rituals. Barstow stirred in the corner. You're not seriously thinking someone tampered with his jam? Not seriously, said Whimsy. Merely whimsically. But the odd thing about murder, Barstow, is that it's so very often wrapped in something utterly pedestrian. One finds the devil more often in teaspoons than in pitchforks. He turned to Elsie again. And you saw no one else that morning? No lights, no sounds? Elsie hesitated. Only the wind, sir. It howled awful all night. Shutters on the east wing banging something dreadful. I thought maybe I heard someone on the gravel about 5. But it might have been the milkman. Or a fox. 5 o'clock? Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Not much light then. No, sir, just grey. I looked out but didn't see anything clear. Whimsy crossed to the window, where the sash hung open a bare inch. A smear of soot along the sill caught his attention. Curious that this should be unlatched. Bit chilly for it. Barstow sniffed. Colonel liked his air, so I'm told. Quite, said Whimsy. But the coal fire was lit. A man with an ulcer might risk indigestion, but surely not pneumonia. He drew a delicate fingertip across the soot. Someone opened this window recently. You can see the cleaner track where the lower pane moved. Barstow frowned. Could have been the maid. But Elsie had gone pale. No, sir. I shut that tight yesterday evening. Colonel told me hisself. Said the draft gave him the ague. Well, well, said Whimsy. Let us suppose, for the sake of idle curiosity, that someone opened this after the maid left and before the colonel died. Why might they do so? Barstow scowled. To get in. But the door was locked from the inside, Whimsy reminded gently. Bolt and key, no sign of force. A trick, maybe. Poison the tea from outside through the window. A little unlikely. One needs a fairly industrious arm to ladle cyanide from the garden into a cup on a tray. Not to mention the unfortunate problem of aim. He paused. No. Something subtler. The cook had been silent until now, perched like an owl on the edge of a chair. Now she cleared her throat. I didn't want to say, sir, but I heard him last night. Talking. Barstow turned sharply. Talking? To whom? That I can't say. It were past 10. I was just checking the pantry, and I heard voices, his and another, lower. Couldn't make out words. Colonel never had callers that late. Always said evenings were for peace and sherry. Where was the voice coming from? Breakfast room, I think. But it was brief, just a minute or two. Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. Ah, so we must entertain the notion that our lonely colonel had a nocturnal visitor. Someone who left no mark, entered unseen, and yet stayed long enough to be heard. Intriguing. Barstow looked irritated. Could be nothing. Could have been the wireless. He never owned one, Gudgeon muttered. Said they were instruments of intellectual rot. Indeed, said Whimsy. Very likely he expired mid-Lansing broadcast, driven to despair by the state of the National Orchestra. Barstow huffed. You're making light of this, my lord. Not in the least. I'm merely preparing to take it seriously. There is a profound difference. He moved again to the clock on the mantelpiece, and with a little noise of satisfaction, pried open the casing. Unwound, he murmured. Odd. The colonel was noted for punctuality, you said. Gudgeon nodded. Never missed a moment, said a man who loses track of the hours halfway to perdition. Then why, Whimsy said, was this clock not wound last night? It runs down every 36 hours, I imagine. Precision mechanism, not the sort you forget. There was silence. Barstow rubbed his temple. So either he neglected his routine, which he never did, or someone tampered with the clock. Whimsy nodded. Indeed. And if one were very clever and very cruel, one might have tampered with it to deceive the eye of the innocent. He turned, suddenly brisk. I should like a list of everyone in the house last night, and any visitors, messengers, or late callers. Also, the milkman's route. Let's confirm whether our 5 o'clock footstep was man or beast. Oh, and Gudgeon, my lord. Has anything at all, gone missing? Silver, papers, a cigarette case, a chess piece. Gudgeon blinked. No, my lord, not to my knowledge, though now you mention it, the colonel's ashtray was moved. Moved? Yes. Always kept it on the left. Last night when I brought in his brandy, it was on the right. Whimsy's eyes gleamed faintly. The left hand forgets what the right remembers. Thank you, Gudgeon. That will be all for now. Barstow waited until the servants had left before exhaling sharply. This is a blasted circus. No, my dear Barstow, Whimsy said, drawing out a cigarette with elegant fingers. This is a chess match, and our opponent, unlike the late colonel, has moved first. He lit the cigarette, inhaled, and gazed at the cooling tray with something like regret. And what a pity. That egg was perfectly poached. The afternoon sun struggled through a ragged veil of clouds as Lord Peter Whimsy and Superintendent Barstow retreated to the library, a cavernous room filled with dusty volumes and the faint, persistent odor of stale tobacco. The atmosphere was notably more conducive to quiet rumination than the turmoil of the breakfast room, where Colonel Fentiman's body still lay under the watchful eyes of a sleepy constabulary and an increasingly nervous household staff. Whimsy settled himself into a high-backed leather chair with a sigh that mingled boredom and curiosity. Now, Barstow, before we descend into the labyrinth of alibis and accusations, let us take stock. We have a victim who was, by all accounts, as punctilious as a Swiss watch, except, notably, his own mantel clock, which was unwound. We have a teapot containing poison, yet no sign of forced entry and a window left slightly ajar against the colonel's preferences. Finally, a nocturnal visitor whose identity is as shadowy as the fog now settling over the grounds. Barstow, weary but alert, nodded. A tidy mess, if ever there was one. Whimsy's gaze drifted to the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. I wonder what time it was when the colonel last wound his clock? Gudgeon, who had been summoned to join them, cleared his throat. He always wound it at 9 in the evening, my lord. Which means, Whimsy mused, that if the clock was found unwound at 8:40 this morning, it must have stopped some hours earlier. Precisely when, we have yet to determine. Have the doctor's findings given any indication of time of death? Barstow asked. Not conclusively, Gudgeon replied. Dr. Merrick's opinion was that the poison acted swiftly, within the hour, he believes. Then we must establish a timeline, Whimsy said, lighting a cigarette with a flourish. Who was in the house at 9 last night, and who thereafter? The butler nodded, producing a neat list from a drawer. The household staff were all accounted for in their quarters by 10. Miss Elsie reported hearing voices around that time, but none saw a visitor. The cook was in the kitchen preparing the next day's provisions. I myself locked the front door at 10:30 after my rounds. Anything unusual about the night visitors or deliveries? Whimsy inquired. Only the milkman, as Miss Elsie mentioned, came early this morning at 5:15. No postman, no other tradesman. Barstow frowned. That 5 o'clock footstep, did anyone verify it? Elsie was summoned back to confirm. She shook her head, eyes wide. No, sir, I couldn't see properly. The mist was thick, but it wasn't the milkman's usual clomp. More like boots, heavier. Boots, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. And no one else to confirm? Only the dog, Elsie added softly. Buster barked once, then was silent. Whimsy smiled faintly. Our canine sentinel, then, had but a moment's doubt. He turned to Barstow. Do we have a list of the Colonel's acquaintances and recent visitors? The superintendent rifled through his notes. The usual circle. Family scattered. None here now. There's a nephew, Gerald Fentiman, who has been nursing a grievance over the Colonel's will, I'm told. A classic suspect, Whimsy said dryly. Any others with motive? Mrs. Pritchard, the Colonel's housekeeper. Some say she was unhappy with the new regime here at Windmere. Indeed. And the servants. Loyal, mostly. Quiet folk, except for Elsie, who's been a bit rattled since finding the body. Whimsy stroked his chin. I think it would be prudent to speak with these individuals directly. Facts, after all, are like the threads of a tapestry. Only when woven together do they reveal the pattern. Barstow agreed, and soon they were standing in the dim corridor outside the drawing room where Gerald Fentiman awaited with an expression that combined defiance and thinly veiled impatience. He was a tall man, somewhat ruddy in complexion, with sharp eyes and an ill-fitting morning coat. Ah, Lord Peter, he said with a forced cordiality. I had hoped to avoid further unpleasantness, but here we are. Mr. Fentiman, Whimsy replied, his tone courteous but firm. Your grief must be sincere, yet I cannot help but notice your impatience to settle your late uncle's affairs. Gerald bristled. He was a difficult man, had his quirks and his grudges. He cut me out of the will entirely, you know. A source of motivation, naturally. Whimsy's gaze was steady. Where were you last night? Gerald's eyes flicked to the side. Out at the club until 10. Others can confirm, then home. Precisely where is your home? Just a mile down the road at Ashbury Manor. Did you visit Windmere Lodge after 10? Number I left no later than 10. Whimsy inclined his head slightly, arching an eyebrow. Can anyone vouch for your whereabouts after 10? Gerald shifted uneasily. My valet saw me in by 10:30. Then we shall confirm that, Whimsy said smoothly. Thank you, Mr. Fentiman. That will be all for now. As Gerald departed, Whimsy turned to Barstow. The nephew's alibi is plausible, but I suspect it is not the whole truth. People are excellent at remembering the hours when it suits them. They then summoned Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, a stern woman whose eyes bore the weight of years, spent managing unruly households and sharper tempers. Mrs. Pritchard, Whimsy began. You have been here long. Over 20 years, my lord, she replied, voice steady. Loyal to the Colonel until the end. Yet I hear you were not pleased with the recent changes at Windmere. Change is difficult, my lord, she admitted reluctantly. But the Colonel was a good man. Strange sometimes. Set in his ways, yes, but kind in his own way. Did you see or hear anything unusual last night? No, my lord. Only the wind and the usual creaks of a house this old. Nothing at all? She hesitated. There was a man, I think. Came to the back door late in the evening, but I sent him away. Didn't recognize him. Did he say who he was? No, my lord. Just asked for the colonel. And you refused to admit him? I did. Colonel's orders were strict. No visitors after dark. Whimsy tapped his cigarette ash thoughtfully. Did you tell anyone about this? Only Gudgeon. Excellent, Whimsy said. We shall want to speak to this gentleman as well, if he can be found. Barstow interjected. And the servants? Any whispers? Any strange behavior? Elsie was brought in again and questioned more thoroughly. She was visibly shaken, but composed enough to provide a precise account of her activities. I locked the back door at 9, sir. Saw no one after. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. But the window was open this morning. Yes, my lord. I don't know how that came to be. A silent question hung between them. Who had entered or exited through that window, and for what purpose? That evening, with the household under polite but firm observation, Whimsy took to pacing the long corridors of Windmere Lodge. The house, with its faded grandeur, seemed to breathe secrets in the settling gloom. He paused by the mantel clock, now in the care of a cautious constable. Tell me, Gudgeon, Whimsy said, when was the last time you saw the colonel alive? About 9:30 last night, my lord. He was in his study, reading, said he'd retire early. And did he appear unwell? No, sir. Just a little tired, I'd say. Whimsy frowned. If he retired at 9:30, how do we explain the voices heard at 10 and the window open this morning? Gudgeon shrugged. Perhaps he left the study. He was known for his solitary walks, even at night. A man with ulcers going for a nocturnal stroll in a damp, misty night? Whimsy mused. Unlikely, but not impossible. The pieces did not yet fit together. The puzzle teased at edges, but refused to yield its center. Returning to the breakfast room, Whimsy inspected the carpet scuff again, this time with a measuring tape borrowed from the butler. The crescent was precisely 2 feet in length, as if someone had shifted their weight uneasily. He bent to examine the window latch. It was newly oiled, making the faint creak that Elsie had heard a curious detail indeed. I wonder, Whimsy muttered, if the window was opened by someone well acquainted with the house's finer points. The butler joined him quietly. Only the colonel, Miss Elsie and I had keys to the study and the windows. And you, Gudgeon, Whimsy said pointedly. Of course. And the cook? No. Very well. He straightened. The suspect list is narrowing, but the question remains, who had the opportunity and who the motive strong enough to force the hand of a man who counted time as one counts a church bell? Barstow exhaled. I wish he'd share his thoughts. Ah, but that is the charm, my dear fellow. Whimsy smiled thinly. A mystery is like a clock itself. The hands may point in many directions, but only one tells the true time. And as the evening shadows lengthened through the mullioned windows of Windmere Lodge, the stage was set for a drama that promised to be as subtle as it was deadly. The following morning brought with it a damp chill that clung to the stone facades of Windmere Lodge and seeped into the bones of its inhabitants. Lord Peter Whimsy, his habitual elegance somewhat dishevelled by the restless night, descended into the dim breakfast room where the household had assembled in various states of quiet tension. The servants exchanged furtive glances, while the household's usual visitors looked decidedly less at ease. Whimsy surveyed the scene with the faintest twitch of a sardonic smile. Ah, the spectacle of polite society under duress, always a fascinating theatre. Barstow stood nearby, rubbing his temples as though attempting to summon clarity from the haze of incomplete testimonies and half-truths. The timeline, Peter. We must stitch it tighter before it unravels completely. Indeed, Whimsy replied, lighting a cigarette with meticulous care. Let us begin by retracing the movements of those present last night and probe deeper into the contradictions. He called upon Gudgeon once again, the butler who bore the look of a man long accustomed to absorbing the secrets of others without betraying a single one of his own. "Gudgeon, pray, walk me through your rounds last night." "As I said before, my lord, I completed my final round at 10:30, ensuring all doors and windows were secure except the one to the library, which the colonel preferred left ajar for ventilation." "Curious," Wimsey murmured. "Given the chill, did you notice anything amiss during your rounds?" "No, sir. Only the usual creaks and groans of an old house." "And Miss Elsie? Did she remain in her quarters?" "Yes, my lord. She retired shortly after 10. Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. "And the household staff? Any unusual behavior or grievances?" "No, my lord. All spoke of the colonel with respect, though Miss Elsie seemed disturbed this morning." "Ah, the young lady's nerves may prove a valuable indicator," Wimsey said, inclining his head toward the kitchen where Elsie was summoned once more. She arrived, cheeks flushed, hands clasped tightly before her. "You wish to speak with me again, my lord?" "Yes, Miss Elsie. Your attentiveness last night was commendable, but I find myself curious about your observation of voices at 10 o'clock. Could you recall the tone, the language, the number of speakers?" Elsie hesitated, then answered, "Two voices, my lord, a man and a woman. They spoke softly, but I caught the man's voice. It was sharp, urgent." "Any words that stand out?" "No, sir. Only must be careful, and not here." Wimsey's eyes glinted. "And the direction?" "From the east wing corridor, near the library door." The pieces began to align in a slow, deliberate manner, each whisper and shadow weaving together a picture at once tantalizing and opaque. Wimsey turned to Barstow. "Do we have records of the household's visitors yesterday?" Barstow produced a ledger, its pages neatly inscribed. "Only the expected. No unexpected guests, save for a stranger reported by Mrs. Pritchard who came late last evening." "Uh-huh," Wimsey said softly. "And Mrs. Pritchard mentioned this gentleman was turned away at the back door." "Yes," Gudgeon confirmed. "Have we any idea of his identity?" "None as yet," Barstow replied. "But I intend to make inquiries in the village." Wimsey smiled thinly. One must always remember that the village knows far more than it cares to reveal. A sudden knock at the door interrupted their discourse. The local vicar, Reverend Blackwood, entered, his expression grave beneath the accustomed veneer of clerical calm. "Lord Peter, Superintendent, I trust I am not intruding." "Not at all, Reverend," Wimsey said politely. "Your presence is welcome." "I wish to offer what assistance I might," Blackwood said, folding his hands. "The tragedy of Colonel Fentiman has unsettled us all. The villagers speak in hushed tones, some even whispering of curses and misfortune." Wimsey arched an eyebrow. "Ah, superstition. Always an unwelcome guest in the parlor of reason." "Indeed, my lord. But even the most rational minds are not immune to fear when faced with the unknown." "Very true," Wimsey agreed. "Yet we must steel ourselves against such distractions." Blackwood nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Might I suggest that we pay particular attention to the colonel's study? The room itself seems to bear witness to the last moments of a troubled man." Wimsey's curiosity was piqued. "A haunted chamber, you mean?" "Not haunted in the spectral sense," the vicar replied, "but imbued with a certain oppressive atmosphere. I have visited the study to pray for the colonel's soul, and felt a weight there, a tension palpable even to one of faith." Wimsey smiled faintly. "A room's mood is often the result of human passions, Reverend, but your insight is appreciated." After the vicar's departure, Wimsey and Barstow turned their attention back to the study. It was a long, narrow room lined with heavy oak shelves, their contents meticulously arranged and dominated by a large mahogany desk facing the window. The scent of pipe tobacco lingered, mingling with the faint mustiness of aged paper. Wimsey examined the desk closely, noting the presence of an open ledger, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. Financial records, perhaps. Indeed, Gudgeon said. The colonel was particular about his accounts. Whimsy's fingers traced the entries, pausing at a series of recent transactions marked in red ink. Payments to a certain Dr. Hamilton, he mused. Curious. Who is this gentleman? Colonel Fentiman's personal physician, Gudgeon explained. He attended to the colonel's ulcers. Then it is prudent to pay Dr. Hamilton a visit, Whimsy said, to learn more about the nature of those ailments and whether they might have played a role in recent events. As the day wore on, the investigation deepened its roots. Whimsy interrogated the servants again, cross-referencing their statements with the timelines and observations he had compiled. One detail began to stand out, a seeming inconsistency in the reported times when the house was secured. The cook, Mrs. Thornley, a stout woman with sharp eyes, reported locking the pantry door at 9:15. Yet Elsie insisted she had seen her still in the kitchen at 9:30. Curious, Whimsy said, for the pantry door to be locked while the cook remains in the kitchen. It suggests either a mistake or an attempt to create a false alibi. Barstow made a note. We shall need to question Mrs. Thornley further. Later, as Whimsy strolled the grounds, the mist lifting slowly to reveal the skeletal trees of late autumn, he considered the puzzle. The open window, the whispered voices, the conflicting accounts, all painted a picture that was as fragmented as it was frustrating. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden call from Barstow. Peter, look here. The superintendent held aloft a scrap of paper, slightly crumpled but legible. It was a note found behind a loose panel in the study's bookshelf. Whimsy took the note, his eyes scanning the elegant script. Beware the hour when shadows fall. The trusted friend may be the pall. A riddle, Whimsy said quietly. Or a warning. Barstow looked dubious. A threat, perhaps. Or the remorse of a guilty conscience, Whimsy said. We must keep this in mind. The discovery added another layer of psychological complexity to the case. Who among the household or visitors was both trusted and suspect, and who might have harbored a motive strong enough to murder? As evening descended, the household gathered again, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight. The study, now examined with renewed scrutiny, had yielded its secrets, but the key to the mystery remained elusive. Whimsy, ever the patient observer, knew the threads were close to converging. The subtle misalignments in time, the whispered conversations, and the veiled resentments all pointed to a truth lurking just beneath the surface. He looked toward the window, now firmly closed, and pondered the puzzle of the open pane at dawn. A clue, no doubt, overlooked because it seemed trivial, he mused. The devil, after all, is in the detail. As he retired for the night, Whimsy's thoughts lingered on the note, the voices, and the shadow of a trusted friend who might be the very Paul the poem warned of. The game was afoot, and the next move would be critical. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The morning broke over Windmere Lodge with a pale and reluctant light, the kind of dawn that seemed to hesitate, uncertain whether to illuminate or to conceal the secrets nestled within the weathered stone walls. Lord Peter, Whimsy, was already at work, seated by the great bay window in the library, surrounded by the gathered scraps of paper and handwritten notes that formed the skeleton of his investigation. His sharp eyes, half hidden beneath a deliberate droop of his eyelids, flicked through the day's latest depositions, seeking that elusive thread which would lead him closer to the truth. Barstow arrived promptly, bearing fresh news from the village. Peter, I've spoken with Mrs. Pritchard and several shopkeepers. That stranger who called last evening appears to be a Mr. Gerald Ashcombe, a man with a reputation as dubious as his punctuality. He claims no connection with Windmere Lodge, but there are rumors of an old business dispute with the colonel, now long buried but not forgotten. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully, tapping the edge of a page with a long, slender finger. Ashcombe, then. An interloper in our serene tableau, just the sort to stir the waters. Yet, Barstow, we must be wary of the natural tendency to seize upon a convenient villain. The truth, as ever, resides deeper and more obliquely. Their conversation was interrupted by Gudgeon, who entered quietly, carrying a small, sealed envelope. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but this was found behind a loose panel in the colonel's desk this morning. It was slipped in with the ledger pages." Whimsy took the envelope and broke the seal with care, revealing a finely penned letter. "To whom it may concern, the past is not as buried as one hopes. The time approaches when debts must be paid in full, and the shadows of yesterday will cast their long fingers over Windmere. Trust no one, not even those who smile in friendship." A faint smile curled Whimsy's lips. "Our game is becoming most theatrical. Letters cloaked in menace, how very Gothic. Yet beneath the florid warnings lies a grim certainty. The killer is close, and the victim knew this." Barstow frowned. "But who would dare send such a letter and yet remain at Windmere?" "Precisely the question," Whimsy murmured. The day unfolded with a series of interviews that peeled back the layers of Windmere's household and its visitors. Each interlocutor offered fragments, sometimes contradictory, sometimes revealing, of a complex social web. Mrs. Thornley, the cook, proved a treasure trove of unintentional information, her candid asides betraying a keen mind and a shrewd grasp of undercurrents. She confessed to overhearing late-night whispers from the servants' quarters, words about a lost inheritance and a shadowy figure who had recently been seen skulking near the stables. "Lost inheritance, you say?" Whimsy inquired, arching a brow. "Yes, my lord. The colonel's nephew, young Andrew, had been expecting to inherit more than he did. There were bitter words I heard. He's sulky as a cat caught in the rain." Andrew Fentiman, the colonel's nephew, had appeared the previous evening as a potential suspect, a man who, despite his youth, carried a simmering resentment like a poisoned dagger beneath his polished manners. Whimsy resolved to speak with Andrew again, sensing the need to examine his timeline more closely. The young man's alibi for the evening of the murder rested on a tenuous claim of reading in his room, alone, with no witnesses. A convenient solitude, perhaps. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Whimsy took a solitary walk through the gardens, reflecting on the discoveries. The open window in the library, the mysterious letters, the whispered voices. It was all too deliberate, as if the murderer wished to stage a drama that would distract from the mechanics of the crime. Back inside, he requested to see the colonel's personal effects, letters, diaries, anything that might reveal the man's state of mind. Gudgeon produced a worn leather journal, its pages heavy with meticulous entries. Whimsy leafed through it with a scholar's reverence, noting the colonel's musings on health, finances, and a recurring anxiety about enemies within the fold. One entry caught his attention. "October 14th, there is a traitor in my midst. I am weary of masks and polite lies. Soon the truth must emerge, and I fear the consequences." The date was 3 days before the murder. Whimsy's mind raced. The colonel had suspected danger, yet had not confided in anyone openly. The killer was not a stranger then, but someone intimately entwined in the fabric of the household. His thoughts returned to Elsie, whose timid testimony held quiet significance. Her glimpse of voices in the East Wing, the urgency in the man's tone, suggested clandestine meetings hidden beneath the veneer of civility. That evening, Whimsy insisted on a thorough inspection of the East Wing corridor. The walls, lined with faded portraits and heavy drapes, bore the musty scent of disuse and secrets. He paused at a door near the library, the one left ajar during Gudgeon's rounds. A faint trace of smoke lingered in the air. Tobacco, perhaps. Whimsy sniffed thoughtfully. Curious. The colonel's study was redolent with pipe tobacco, yet here is a different scent altogether. A cigarette, perhaps, rather than a pipe. Barstow nodded. Could it be that someone was meeting here in secret? Or waiting? The pair examined the floorboards for signs of disturbance and found a slight scuff near the threshold, barely noticeable unless one knew precisely what to seek. "It is the faintest footprint," Whimsy said, "but its placement suggests someone lingered here long enough for the dust to shift." Their scrutiny revealed a further oddity. The lock on the door showed signs of recent tampering, the mechanism stiff but serviceable. "An entry or exit by unconventional means," Whimsy concluded. As they explored further, a sudden noise, a clatter from the adjacent room, startled them. Barstow drew his revolver and moved cautiously forward, but Whimsy raised a hand. "Hold. Let us first discover if the disturbance is natural or contrived." They found Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, standing by a toppled vase, her hands trembling. "Forgive me, gentlemen. I was retrieving some linens when I knocked it over." Whimsy's gaze softened, but his mind was already at work. Mrs. Pritchard's nervousness was genuine, yet he filed the incident away as part of the growing tapestry of tension. Returning to the library, Whimsy shared his observations. "We have now confirmed several points. A clandestine meeting near the study, a secret correspondence warning of betrayal, and a household simmering with resentments." Barstow looked grim. "It is a web indeed." "Precisely. And the spider must be someone close, whose actions are hidden behind masks of loyalty." That night, Whimsy retired with a bundle of papers, and the growing suspicion that the case was as much a psychological battle as a search for tangible clues. The Gothic trappings, the ominous letters, the whispered warnings were but the flourish of a mind desperate to conceal the truth. In the quiet dark, he pondered the final detail that gnawed at him: the discrepancy in the clocks. The kitchen clock was 10 minutes slow, the grandfather clock in the hall fast by 7. These mismatches, initially dismissed as mere quirks of old mechanisms, suddenly took on new weight. A plan formed in Whimsy's mind. The precision of time was the key to unmasking the killer's alibi, and thus the path to justice. Before sleep claimed him, he lit a final cigar, inhaled deeply, and smiled faintly. The game was tightening around the murderer. The next dawn promised revelations, and perhaps the first glimpse of the hand that had dealt death at Windmere Lodge. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the winding lanes around Windmere Lodge, when Lord Peter Whimsy once again took up his post in the study, a quiet sentinel amid the slowly shifting shadows. The house, still groggy from the night's uneasy rest, creaked and sighed as the servants busied themselves, their whispers and footsteps the only sounds in a house waiting to reveal its darkest secrets. Whimsy sat with his hands folded, eyes half closed, pondering the curious discrepancies in the clocks. He had long held that time, in its precise and unyielding march, was the surest ally of the detective. A small clock's failure, a minute gained here, a few lost there, were not mere quirks. They were subtle manipulations, the fingerprint of a cunning mind seeking to obscure the moments that mattered. His suspicions turned to the servants first. Their routines, tightly regimented, might be exploited or feigned. The kitchen clock, 10 minutes slow, had allowed Mrs. Thornley to claim the pantry was locked by 9:15, while she was seen in the kitchen 20 minutes later. The hall clock's haste of 7 minutes, on the other hand, cast a shadow over the household's understanding of the precise time. Colonel Fentiman was last seen alive. Barstow arrived with the latest news from his inquiries. "Peter, I've spoken with Dr. Hamilton. His account is intriguing." Whimsy gestured for Barstow to continue, already sensing the threads pulling taut. "Go on." "The doctor confirms he was with the colonel during the afternoon, treating him for ulcers. He insists he left around 6:30, but when questioned about his whereabouts later, he was vague. No one can account for him after dinner, and he declined to stay overnight, claiming urgent business in the nearby town." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "A convenient absence, especially if one considers the murder occurred soon after. Indeed. And Peter, the doctor seems uneasy when pressed about the Colonel's condition. Curious, was the ailment as serious as reported? Barstow shook his head. The doctor admitted privately that the ulcers were superficial, nothing likely to cause immediate concern. Yet he hinted the Colonel had more serious troubles. Matters of the mind, he called them. Psychological rather than physical malaise. The Colonel's own journal entries spoke of enemies and betrayal. Our good doctor might be the bearer of unwelcome truths or the keeper of secrets. Wimsey rose and began pacing the room, the creak of his shoes on the worn carpet echoing softly. It seems the doctor's role is pivotal. We must bring him here, with the superintendent's assistance, and observe him closely. The arrival of Dr. Hamilton in the late morning was accompanied by a palpable tension. The physician's neat appearance and clinical manner could not entirely conceal a certain nervousness, a darting gaze that flicked past Wimsey with barely concealed calculation. Wimsey greeted him with the faintest arch of a smile. "Dr. Hamilton, thank you for coming on such short notice. We find ourselves in a most perplexing situation." "Indeed, Lord Peter," the doctor replied, voice calm but eyes wary. "I trust my presence will aid your investigations." Wimsey settled into a chair, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, Doctor, about your last visit to the Colonel on the evening in question." Dr. Hamilton cleared his throat. "I saw him around 4 o'clock. He was in good spirits then, though troubled, as you might expect. After our consultation, I left him around 6:30, as I mentioned to Superintendent Barstow. And after that, I returned to my practice in Cheston. There were urgent matters requiring my attention, patients awaiting care." Wimsey's gaze narrowed. "No one saw you leave Windmere?" "No, I traveled alone. It was a short journey, and I returned the following morning." Wimsey exchanged a glance with Barstow, then turned back. "And your relationship with the Colonel? I understand you were more than a physician. You were also a confidant." Dr. Hamilton hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes. The Colonel confided in me his fears of betrayal and secret enemies within his household." "Did he name these enemies?" "Number. He was circumspect. There was something, some shadow, he refused to fully disclose." "Fascinating," Wimsey said quietly. "And yet, the doctor keeps secrets even from the police and myself." Barstow pressed. "Doctor, can you account for your whereabouts after dinner last night?" The doctor's composure flickered. "I was at home, preparing for surgery scheduled the next day." Wimsey raised a finger. "May I see your schedule and alibi corroborated?" Dr. Hamilton offered a reluctant nod. "Of course." As the doctor departed to produce his alibi, Wimsey turned his thoughts to the household once more. The note hidden behind the ledger, the whispered voices, the open window, all pointed to someone who had both opportunity and intimate knowledge of the estate. He decided it was time to revisit Andrew Fentiman, the Colonel's nephew, whose resentment was no secret. The young man's earlier claims of solitude in his room during the murder were unverified and suspiciously convenient. Wimsey found Andrew pacing the drawing room, restless and agitated. "Mr. Fentiman," Wimsey began, his tone both polite and firm, "we must revisit your movements on the evening of your uncle's death." Andrew bristled. "I've already told the police everything. I was in my room all evening." "Alone?" Andrew hesitated. "Yes. Not a soul to corroborate?" "No, but I have no reason to lie." Wimsey inclined his head slightly. "Yet your bitterness over your inheritance is well known. May I ask, did you speak with your uncle during the day?" "Yes, at lunch. He was distant, cold." "Did he mention any concerns or threats?" "No, but I sensed he was troubled. I regret now that I did not press him. Indeed, sometimes silence speaks louder than words." Wimsey's eyes scanned the young man's face, noting the tight jaw and restless fingers. "Tell me, Andrew, Have you ever had disagreements with the staff, particularly Mrs. Thornley or Elsie? Andrew's face reddened. I admit, the staff and I have never been close. I do not trust them. Trust is a fragile thing, Mr. Fentiman, especially in a house where shadows lengthen and truths hide in corners. The interview left Whimsy with more questions than answers, but the young man's agitation was noted for future consideration. Later, returning to the study, Whimsy found Barstow examining the household clocks, now with an analytical eye. Peter, I believe the clocks are the key to unraveling the timeline. Barstow pointed to the kitchen clock, its minute hand lagging noticeably behind the hall's grandfather clock. If the kitchen clock is slow by 10 minutes and the hall clock fast by 7, then an event timed according to either could be off by as much as 17 minutes. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. And the colonel was last seen by the butler, Gudgeon, at 9:30 according to the hall clock. But if the hall clock is fast, then the real time was closer to 9:23. Precisely. Now, Elsie heard voices at 10 o'clock. If she was referencing the kitchen clock, that could mean it was closer to 10:15 actual time. And that discrepancy creates a window for the killer to act unseen. Whimsy tapped his fingers on the desk. We must reconstruct the exact times of each observation and alibi, correcting for clock errors. As evening fell, Whimsy instructed Barstow to gather the household and reconstruct the timeline aloud. One by one, each person was called to state their whereabouts, using their own references to time, while Barstow and Whimsy adjusted for the known clock errors. The contradictions were stark. Mrs. Thornley claimed to have locked the pantry at 9:15 kitchen time, but Elsie saw her still in the kitchen after that. Andrew claimed solitude from 9 to 11 by hall clock time, yet the grandfather clock's inaccuracy suggested he might have left his room unobserved during the crucial minutes. Dr. Hamilton's absence after 6 could be corroborated only by his own vague claims and his appointment schedule, yet there were no witnesses to confirm. And Gudgeon, the butler, maintained the last sighting of the colonel at 9:30, yet no one saw the colonel alive after that. Whimsy's voice cut through the murmurs. The clocks conspire to mislead us. Yet, in their mischief, they have also revealed the truth. The timeline given by several witnesses is artificially constructed to hide the killer's movements. Barstow looked to Whimsy, who then had both the opportunity and the motive. Whimsy smiled faintly, the familiar glint of triumph in his eye. Patience, my dear Barstow. The answer lies not only in who, but also in why, and the key to the why rests with the double lives people lead. He paused, taking a slow draw from his cigar. Tomorrow, we unmask the secret held close to the heart of Windmere Lodge. The house settled into silence, but for Whimsy, the gears of deduction were turning ever faster. The tangled web of trust and betrayal was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, ready to reveal the murderer concealed beneath the mask of civility. The morning light crept slowly through the heavy drapes of Windmere Lodge, casting long shadows across the polished floorboards and lending an almost sepulchral air to the grand old house. Lord Peter Whimsy sat quietly by the window in the study, sipping his morning tea, his thoughts far from the mild domesticity of his surroundings. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on, precise, unyielding, while the web of lies and half-truths that enmeshed this household tightened invisibly about them all. The prior evening's reconstruction of the timeline had unearthed inconsistencies so glaring as to demand immediate attention. The falsified times, the conflicting alibis, and the suspicious silences all pointed toward a calculated orchestration. But in the tangled skein of deceit, Whimsy sensed the faintest thread that, once pulled, would unravel the entire design. Barstow entered briskly, bearing a folder of papers and an expression that balanced frustration with determination. Peter, I have the doctor's schedule and the accounts from Cheston Hospital. His claimed surgeries on the night in question were logged, but strangely, none began until well after 9 o'clock. Whimsy arched a brow. Curious. So his alibi is partly fabricated. Exactly. There is no witness to his departure from Windmere, nor to his arrival in Cheston at the alleged time. Whimsy's smile was sardonic. Our good doctor is fond of mystery, it seems. One wonders whether he fancied himself more a playwright than a practitioner of medicine. More than that, Barstow said quietly. There's something else. The Colonel's medical records mention a second condition, concealed from most significant neurological symptoms. They might explain his paranoia. Whimsy's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Aha. So the Colonel was not merely worried, but perhaps genuinely afflicted, which may have made him vulnerable to manipulation. They heard footsteps approaching. Mrs. Thornley, the housekeeper, appeared at the door, her face drawn and pale. Lord Peter, Superintendent Barstow, she said, voice low. There's something I must confess. About the pantry door. Whimsy gestured for her to sit. Go on, Mrs. Thornley. She swallowed nervously. The pantry door was not locked at 9:15, as I told you. I only pretended so to cover for Elsie. She went back there after dinner to fetch some preserves, and I did not want to get her into trouble. Whimsy's eyes twinkled. Ah, small acts of kindness in the midst of suspicion. Barstow frowned. Mrs. Thornley, was Elsie alone in the pantry? No, sir. Andrew Fentiman came in just after her. I thought it odd at the time. Indeed, Whimsy murmured. And Andrew claims he was in his room all evening, yet here we have a direct contradiction. Mrs. Thornley nodded. I didn't say anything because I feared reprisal, but now, with the Colonel dead, I think the truth must come out. Whimsy made a note. Thank you, Mrs. Thornley. Your honesty is most appreciated. Later, Whimsy sought out Elsie, the maid, whose eyes held a mixture of fear and resolve. Elsie, you were near the pantry after dinner. Yes, Lord Peter. I was fetching preserves, as Mrs. Thornley said, but I heard voices, arguing quietly. Voices? Did you recognize them? No, but one was definitely Mr. Andrews. Interesting. Did you hear what was said? Only fragments. Something about the will and the old man's debts. They were angry. Whimsy leaned forward. And did you see what happened after? No, sir. I was scared and left quickly. The pieces began to coalesce. Andrew's motive was clearer now, fueled not only by inheritance, but by debts and desperation. Yet the question remained, how did this lead to murder? That afternoon, Whimsy requested to examine the Colonel's private study again. This time his eyes were drawn to the rows of books on law and finance and to a small, locked drawer in the desk. The housekeeper produced the key, her hands trembling. Whimsy opened the drawer to find a sheaf of papers, legal documents, letters, and a will, the ink still fresh on its pages. He read silently, his mind piecing together the implications. The new will disinherited Andrew, favoring instead a distant cousin and a charitable foundation. This explained the nephew's desperation and perhaps his reckless behavior. But there was more. Tucked beneath the documents was a folded note in the Colonel's hand, hinting at blackmail and betrayal within the household. Whimsy's eyes glinted. The plot thickens. That evening, he called the household together in the drawing room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice calm but commanding attention, the investigation has revealed much about loyalty and duplicity within these walls. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. It is clear that our victim was a man tormented not only by physical ailment, but by fears of treachery. He acted to protect himself through his will and guarded secrets that placed him in peril. Whimsy turned to Andrew. Your presence near the pantry and your financial desperation provide strong motive, yet motive alone does not confirm guilt. He then addressed Dr. Hamilton. And you, Doctor, your absence during the critical hours and your knowledge of the Colonel's condition make you a person of interest. The room grew taut with anticipation. Whimsy continued, But what ties these threads into the fabric of murder is a subtle manipulation of time and circumstance. The clocks, the locked doors, the voices heard and unheard, all were part of a carefully constructed stage play designed to mislead. He glanced at Mrs. Thornley and Elsie. Your courage in speaking the truth is commendable and has been crucial. Turning back to the assembly, Whimsy's voice took on a sharper edge. Tonight, we will recreate the events leading to the Colonel's death, with all present to witness. The truth, long concealed, will emerge. The household exchanged uneasy glances, the anticipation electric. As the night deepened, Lord Peter Wimsey stood poised to draw back the final curtain on the enigma that had shadowed Windmere Lodge. The truth was close, closer than anyone yet dared admit, and its revelation would be as unsettling as it was illuminating. The game was set, the players revealed. Only the final act remained. The drawing room was transformed into a theater of shadows and whispers, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly against the night's chill, the only light a circle of lamplight casting long, uncertain silhouettes upon the faces gathered within. Lord Peter Wimsey moved with a deliberate grace among the assembled household, his gaze flickering from one anxious expression to another, the measured cadence of his voice commanding their attention even before a word was spoken. Let us consider, first, he began, the exact sequence of events on the evening of Colonel Fairbairn's unfortunate demise. I shall ask for your cooperation in reconstructing this timeline as precisely as possible. Therein lies the key to untangling the web of deceit. Andrew Fentiman, pale and taut, nodded stiffly. I understand, Lord Peter. Wimsey inclined his head. Very good. Now, Mrs. Thornley, you have already admitted to some minor falsifications concerning the pantry door. Might you kindly recount the movements of Elsie and Mr. Fentiman in greater detail? The housekeeper, cheeks flushed with embarrassment but resolute, began. Elsie went to the pantry shortly after dinner, around 8:45, to fetch preserves. I followed shortly after to check on her, and Andrew was already there. They spoke in low voices. I did not hear all they said, but I caught mention of the will and debts. Thank you, Wimsey said, making a meticulous note. And Andrew, you acknowledge being present in the pantry at that time? Andrew's voice was a brittle whisper. Yes. I wanted to speak with Elsie privately. I hoped she might have information about the Colonel's intentions. A murmur rippled through the room. Elsie's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm crossing her features. Wimsey caught it but said nothing. Instead, he turned to the doctor, who sat rigid in his chair, hands clasped tightly. Dr. Hamilton, you have asserted your presence in your study from 8 until 10:30. Can you confirm this timeline? Hamilton's lip curled with something between disdain and fatigue. I was attending to medical journals, my lord. I had no reason to leave. And yet, Wimsey observed dryly, no one witnessed you there during this period. Quite right, the doctor replied evenly. The study is private. I require solitude. Understandable, Wimsey conceded. However, the clock in your study stopped at precisely 9:15. A curious coincidence, would you not agree? The doctor's gaze flickered, but he said nothing. Wimsey's smile was faintly triumphant. We shall return to this anomaly shortly. He shifted his attention to Mrs. Penrose, the distant cousin and beneficiary of the new will, who had sat quietly, her composure impeccable despite the tension. Madam, you have stated that you arrived at Windmere Lodge late afternoon and spent most of the evening in the drawing room. Can anyone corroborate your presence? Mrs. Penrose nodded crisply. Mr. Barstow was here until nearly 9, and Elsie brought me tea at intervals. Excellent, Wimsey said. Your timeline seems solid. He then produced a small hand mirror, a curious object that had lain unnoticed on the sideboard, its glass cracked in a jagged line. This mirror, he said, was found beneath the Colonel's desk on the morning of the murder. Might I inquire if anyone recognizes it? A murmur passed among the guests. Elsie's eyes darted to Andrew, whose face hardened. "I do," Andrew said at last. "It belonged to my late mother." "Curious," Wimsey mused. "And why would it be beneath the Colonel's desk, do you think?" Andrew shrugged, but the hesitation betrayed more than words. Wimsey let the silence linger before continuing. "Now, the pantry door. We know it was unlocked at 8:45, yet the Colonel was found dead shortly after 9, strangled in his study. Mrs. Thornley, you mentioned hearing voices. Could you identify any more precisely?" Mrs. Thornley took a deep breath. "It was 2 men arguing. Their voices were low but angry. I could not hear everything, but I heard debts, will, and a name, Fairbairn." "Interesting," Wimsey said. "Andrew, can you account for any such argument?" Andrew shifted uncomfortably. "I argued with no one. Yet you spoke with Elsie in the pantry." "Yes, but it was not an argument." The maid Elsie bit her lip, finally breaking her silence. "Mr. Fentiman was angry. He threatened to tell the Colonel about something Elsie had done. He said it might ruin her." Wimsey's interest piqued. "And what might that be?" Elsie's voice was barely audible. I broke a vase, an old family heirloom. I was going to confess, but Mr. Fentiman said it would be better to keep it quiet." The room seemed to contract with the weight of this revelation. Wimsey regarded Andrew with narrowed eyes. Threats and secrets, a potent mixture, indeed. Then, turning back to the doctor, he continued, "Dr. Hamilton, you mentioned medical journals. Yet the stopped clock in your study implies a disruption. If I may be so bold, might you have ventured out briefly during this period?" Hamilton's eyes darkened. "I will not dignify speculation with answers." "As you wish," Wimsey said, unabashed. "But do recall, the Colonel was found strangled, an act requiring strength and opportunity." He gestured toward Andrew and the doctor in turn. "One of you had both." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Barstow entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I have just received this from Cheston," he announced. "It was found in the postmark room, addressed to the Colonel, but delayed in transit." Wimsey took the parcel carefully, peeling back the paper to reveal a bundle of letters and a photograph. The photograph was a grainy black and white image of the Colonel, standing beside a woman unknown to all, present. Wimsey examined it closely. "This lady," he mused, "appears unfamiliar to us, and these letters, quite recent." He read aloud from one, the words dripping with menace. "Your secrets will come to light, or your family shall suffer consequences." A hush fell over the room. "Blackmail," Wimsey said softly. "And motive." He laid the letters on the table and looked each person in turn. "It seems our Colonel's fears were well-founded, and someone here, or near here, sought to silence him." The atmosphere grew heavy with suspicion, but Wimsey's eyes twinkled with the thrill of the hunt. Tonight's revelations only deepen the mystery. But as dawn approaches, I am confident the truth will be unveiled. The assembled household exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tightening noose of Lord Peter Wimsey's scrutiny. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation. The night at Windmere Lodge had become a stage where secrets would soon be played out in full, the final act yet to begin. The candlelight flickered low, casting the faces of Windmere Lodge's occupants into a dance of half-shadows as the night deepened. Lord Peter Wimsey paced slowly by the hearth, the letters and photograph laid out before him like pieces on a chessboard awaiting their decisive move. The chill outside seemed to seep in through the heavy walls, as if the house itself bore witness to the secrets it harbored. "We find ourselves at a most curious juncture," Wimsey said softly, his voice carrying the hint of ironic detachment that had become his signature. The Colonel was a man beset by shadows, both external and internal. Blackmail, a contested will, threats whispered behind locked doors. None of this is happenstance. He looked across at the assembled group. each face taut with anticipation or thinly veiled guilt. It behooves us, then, to consider not merely who wished the colonel harm, but why and how the fatal hour was engineered. Barstow stepped forward, eyes bright despite the hour. "The blackmail letters," he began, "were posted from Cheston, though delayed. That suggests the sender is either local or cunning enough to manipulate the postal system." Whimsy nodded. "Indeed, Superintendent, yet the handwriting is unfamiliar to any in the household. Nor do these missives bear the personal flourish one might expect from a bitter relative or acquaintance. A professional, perhaps, or someone seeking to remain anonymous." His gaze fixed on Andrew Fentiman. "Mr. Fentiman, you have no knowledge of these letters, do you?" Andrew's jaw tightened. "None. Nor, I take it, of the woman in this photograph." Whimsy held it up, the grainy image of the colonel beside the unknown lady meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Mrs. Penrose shifted but said nothing. Elsie glanced nervously toward the doctor, who sat impassive yet watchful. "I confess," the doctor finally said, "that I have seen this woman before, at a distance on one occasion when I was visiting the colonel some weeks past." Whimsy arched a brow. "Can you tell us who she was, Doctor?" "An old acquaintance from the colonel's youth, as I understand it." "Nothing more." "Curious," Whimsy mused, "that the past should return with such insistence and danger. One wonders what debts of the heart or conscience lingered unresolved." The doctor said nothing further. Whimsy moved to the window, looking out at the wind-tossed trees beyond the grounds. "We know the colonel was strangled in his study sometime shortly after 9 p.m. Yet the evidence suggests the killer manipulated both time and circumstance to create an alibi." He turned back. "Mrs. Thornley, your admission that the pantry door was unlocked at 8:45 contradicts earlier statements. Elsie heard voices, arguing men, and Andrew confirms his presence there, yet he claims to have been alone in his room thereafter." "Which he could not have been," Barstow interjected, and Dr. Hamilton's stopped clock at 9:15 further undermines his claimed whereabouts. Whimsy smiled thinly. "And yet, it is the smallest details which often prove the most telling. A cracked mirror, a broken vase, a locked drawer, all tokens of hidden strife and concealed truths." He paused, then approached the mantelpiece, where a small clock ticked quietly, its hands fixed stubbornly at 9:12. "I have been reflecting on the stoppage of the doctor's study clock, a deliberate act, I suspect, to obscure the true time of the murder. The killer wished to mask their exit or presence." The room was silent, save for the steady tick-tock of the mantel clock. "Dr. Hamilton," Whimsy continued, "you professed to be engrossed in your journals, yet you offered no witnesses. Might one ask if your medical expertise was called upon at any moment during the evening?" "I treated no one that night," the doctor replied coolly. "Curious," Whimsy said. "You surely knew the colonel's frailty. Might you not have been summoned for a crisis?" The doctor's composure flickered for a heartbeat. "The colonel was spirited away before any such intervention could occur." Whimsy inclined his head. "A spirited departure indeed, yet I cannot help but wonder at the significance of your knowledge about the colonel's neurological symptoms. Was it mere professional concern, or something more personal?" The doctor rose suddenly, his eyes sharp. "I tire of insinuations." "Patience, Doctor," Whimsy replied smoothly. "We are all under scrutiny here, including the faithful servants whose roles often mask deeper knowledge." He looked at Elsie. "You heard the argument in the pantry. Did you observe anything else unusual?" Her voice was low, trembling slightly. "After Mr. Fentiman left, I heard footsteps in the hall near the study. Heavy steps. Then silence." "Could it have been the killer?" Barstow asked. "I think so," Elsie said. "I was too afraid to look." Whimsy nodded approvingly. "Courage often reveals what stealth seeks to hide." He then addressed the room with a conspiratorial air. If the murder was planned, the killer must have calculated the layout of this house, the positions of clocks and servants, the timing of every footfall. We have already seen that the locked pantry door was an invention to mislead. Turning to Mrs. Penrose, Wimsey asked, "You are not in need of the Colonel's legacy, madam." Her face was unreadable. "I only seek to honor his memory." Wimsey's smile was faintly sardonic. Noble sentiments are often tested most when fortune is at stake. The assembled household murmured, the tension thickening. "Let us consider the broken vase," Wimsey said, producing a small shard from his pocket. Elsie admitted to its destruction and to hiding the damage under threat of exposure. Might this trivial act have been the spark that ignited the fire of vengeance? Elsie's eyes were tearful. "I never meant to cause harm. I only wanted to do my duty." "And yet," Wimsey said gently, "it appears that secrets and guilt are the currency of this household." He paused, then looked once more at the letters. The blackmailer's identity remains elusive, but their intent is clear, to fracture trust and breed suspicion. And it is that very suspicion which allows murder to flourish unseen. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, a mournful echo to the unrest within. Wimsey's gaze swept over the gathered faces once more. Tonight, the last act awaits, for the truth is never as obscure as it seems, only patiently concealed. The clock chimed 10, its clear tones marking the passage of time and the imminence of revelation. "Now, if you will indulge me," Wimsey said, "I shall retire to prepare a demonstration of our findings, a reenactment of the evening's fatal movements. I invite you all to observe closely. Sometimes the past speaks loudest when recreated in the present." The household nodded, the mingled anticipation and dread palpable. As Wimsey withdrew to his chambers, the weight of the night seemed to deepen. Behind polite facades and civil words, the gears of motive and opportunity were grinding inexorably toward their conclusion. And Lord Peter Wimsey, with his ever-keen eye for detail and his characteristic blend of wit and gravity, was poised to deliver the unmasking that would lay bare the shadowed heart of Windmere Lodge. The heavy oak door of the drawing-room creaked open, admitting Lord Peter Wimsey, his silhouette sharply defined against the low glow of a solitary reading lamp. The assembled household, still weary from the long hours and restless questions, watched with a mixture of fatigue and curiosity. The faint scent of cigar smoke clung to Wimsey's coat, a habitual accompaniment to his contemplations as he crossed the room with deliberate steps. "My friends," he began, his voice calm but edged with the unmistakable spark of intellectual command. "It is time we laid before you the truth of that tragic evening at Windmere Lodge. Truth, I assure you, more curious than fiction, more intricate than the most Gothic tale." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle before continuing. "In our inquiries, we have uncovered a web of concealments, artful deceit, and motives as old as human nature itself. Jealousy, fear, and the dread of disgrace. Yet, as in all mysteries, the devil resides in the details." Wimsey gestured toward the fireplace mantel, where the small clock stood silent, its hands frozen at 9:12. This stopped clock was the first piece of the puzzle, a deliberate act to confound the timeline and to disguise the moment of death. He turned to Barstow. "You noticed the inconsistencies in the testimonies concerning the pantry door and the whereabouts of Mr. Fentiman?" The superintendent nodded. Indeed, several statements conflicted. The pantry door was found unlocked despite previous insistence to the contrary. Mr. Fentiman's alibi did not withstand scrutiny, and Elsie's nervousness was telling. Wimsey smiled faintly. "Yet suspicion alone does not equate to guilt. Our next discovery concerns the blackmail letters, sent not from a distant town, but from within Cheston itself, their delayed posting designed to mislead and delay suspicion." His gaze swept the room and settled on Mrs. Penrose, who, despite her calm exterior, seemed the faintest shade paler. "Madame, The letters you received threatened the exposure of secrets that would have brought ruin upon the colonel. Secrets tied not only to his affairs, but to his very past. He produced the photograph again, placing it carefully on the table. This woman, Mrs. Helen Markham, was the key. An old flame of the colonel's, her presence rekindled old fears and old debts. She was seen by Dr. Hamilton during a discreet visit weeks before the tragedy. Wimsey fixed the doctor with a glance as cold and precise as a scalpel. "Doctor, your knowledge of the colonel's neurological condition and your peculiar movements on the night in question demanded attention." Hamilton's eyes flickered with annoyance, but remained composed. "I had no part in the murder, Lord Peter." "Of course not," Wimsey replied smoothly. "Yet your presence near the study at a critical moment is undeniable. You claim to be occupied with your journals, but that is insufficient as an alibi." Wimsey then shifted his focus to Andrew Fentiman. "Your hurried departure from the pantry and your inability to account fully for your actions during the crucial window are problematic. The footsteps Elsie heard, heavy and deliberate, were likely yours." Andrew's expression hardened. "I was trying to leave before things escalated." "Precisely," Wimsey agreed. "But your haste was not merely from fear, but from an attempt to avoid being implicated." The detective moved to the mantelpiece again, retrieving the shard of the broken vase. Elsie's broken vase was the catalyst, a small incident that disturbed a fragile equilibrium. Fear of exposure and the resulting tension caused tempers to flare, but the murder itself required a far more calculated plan. He paced slowly, allowing the assembled company to absorb each word, each implication. The killer understood the layout of Windmere Lodge intimately. They manipulated the stopped clock, unlocked the pantry door to create confusion, and used the conflicting statements to muddle the timeline. His eyes narrowed as he faced the room. Who then had the opportunity, the motive, and the cunning to orchestrate such a scheme? The room held its breath. "Dr. Hamilton," Wimsey said, his tone low yet unmistakably firm. "You alone possessed the knowledge to exploit the colonel's condition. The strangulation, executed with a cord found among your medical supplies, was both swift and silent, an act designed to mimic natural causes." Hamilton's lips thinned. "You have no proof." "Proof," Wimsey replied, "is found in the minutiae. Your clock stopped at 9:15, but the real time of death was closer to 9 o'clock. The locked study door was no barrier to you. Your keys fit all locks in the household. The missing salver, which was found later under the hearth, bore your fingerprints, likely dropped in haste." He turned to Elsie and Mrs. Penrose. "You too played parts in this tragedy. Mrs. Penrose by shielding the doctor, and Elsie by attempting to conceal evidence out of misplaced loyalty or fear." Mrs. Penrose's face blanched, while Elsie buried her face in her hands. "Let us not forget the blackmailer," Wimsey continued. "The letters were penned by a hand desperate to protect a secret, but the real secret was far more tragic. The colonel's youthful indiscretion with Mrs. Markham left behind a son, an heir unknown to the family, and a threat to inheritance." He glanced meaningfully at Andrew. "And Andrew Fentiman was that son, a man caught between resentment and desire for recognition." Andrew's shoulders slumped. "I only wanted the truth to come out." "Truth," Wimsey said softly, "has its own way of surfacing, but when combined with fear and misjudgment, it can lead to ruin." The room was silent, save for the crackling fire. Wimsey folded his hands. "In closing, the murder of Colonel Windmere was a tragedy born of human frailty, greed, jealousy, and fear of disgrace. The killer, Dr. Hamilton, saw no alternative to silence the colonel's threats and protect his own reputation. The other players, ensnared by loyalty and guilt, unwittingly compounded the deception." He looked each person in the eye, a subtle smile flickering. "And now that the truth stands revealed, we may hope that Windmere Lodge can finally lay its ghosts to rest." As he spoke, the first faint light of dawn began to pierce the drawn curtains, promising a new day. Barstow stepped forward to place a hand lightly on the doctor's shoulder. "Dr. Hamilton, I believe you will wish to come with me." Hamilton hesitated, then nodded in weary resignation. Wimsey turned to the others. "I trust the dawn will bring with it a measure of peace and the hope of better things to come." As the household dispersed quietly, Wimsey lingered for a moment by the window, inhaling the cool morning air. His thoughts were already turning to the next puzzle, the next human folly to be unraveled with wit and precision. With a final glance around the now silent house, he lit a fresh cigar and murmured to himself, "All's well that ends with a touch of logic and a pinch of irony." And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped away from Windmere Lodge, the mystery behind him, but the endless pursuit of truth ever before him. The drawing room, now stripped of its earlier tension, held a quiet dignity as Lord Peter Wimsey settled into his favorite chair, the smoke from his cigar curling upward in lazy spirals. The household was gathered, not in accusation or fear, but in the slow gathering of understanding, the delicate settling of unease. Wimsey's gaze drifted over the faces before him, some relieved, others still shrouded in shadow. "One finds in such curious affairs," he began with his characteristic archness, "that the grand design often lies not in the tempestuous passions, but in the subtle gears of human weakness and circumstance, a tangled skein woven by folly and fear." He tapped the ash from his cigar, his voice softening. "To recap, the facts as they must now stand. Colonel Windmere was not felled by chance or supernatural malice, but by the hand of a man driven to desperation, Dr. Hamilton. It was he who, fearing exposure and disgrace, chose to silence the colonel before his threats could rip apart the fragile fabric of the household." Wimsey paused to allow this to settle. The stopped clock was no accident, but a cunning ruse designed to confound time itself, a gambit intended to make an impossible alibi plausible. Turning his eyes to the doctor, now pale but composed, Wimsey continued, "Your knowledge of the colonel's frailties, his health, his habits, gave you a cruel advantage. The strangulation, executed with a cord discreetly kept among your instruments, was swift, precise, and intended to mimic natural death. Hamilton's defense was a whisper. I did not wish to kill him. It was meant to be a warning." "Warnings," Wimsey mused dryly, "have a way of spiraling into finalities unforeseen." The detective's attention then turned to Andrew Fentiman. "You, sir, are no villain, merely a pawn trapped by your own complicated birthright. Your urgency to uncover your true lineage was understandable, yet your actions, while not criminal, contributed to the fog of suspicion." Andrew nodded, a mixture of regret and relief in his eyes. Mrs. Penrose and Elsie exchanged glances, and Wimsey addressed them gently. "Loyalty is a double-edged sword. You sought to protect those you loved, yet in doing so, you nearly ensnared yourselves in deceit. It is a mercy that truth, though delayed, has now found its place." Wimsey leaned forward, a mischievous glint returning to his eyes. One might have fancied a tale of ghosts or occult intrigue, given the peculiar atmosphere of Windmere Lodge. But alas, the supernatural was little more than a mask for all too human fear and frailty. He rose, folding his hands behind his back. "So we are left, not with dark incantations or eerie curses, but with something infinitely more complex, the human heart." As he prepared to depart, Wimsey offered one last wry observation. I dare say, had Shakespeare witnessed this play, he might have quipped, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in the stars, but in ourselves." With that, the detective allowed himself a faint smile and a final, thoughtful drag on his cigar. Outside, the morning sun broke fully over Windmere, promising clarity and, perhaps, a future unshadowed by secrets. And with the case closed, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped once more into the world, his keen mind forever alert to the next mystery, the next challenge to reason, and the ever-entertaining folly of mankind.